Welcome back to our basics discussion. Today's subject is the bell curve. I'm your host, Crazy Aunt Nay. I'm sure you've heard this term before, but you may or may not be sure what it means. This is an extremely important subject, especially when it comes to intelligent discourse. It's important to understand this. In many discussions today, including online and even in the news, we see people use two arguments based on the bell curve to try to forcibly assert their position is 100% right. So let me show you how this works. The bell curve is what is called a normal distribution. This sounds really mathy, but stay with me. I'm sure you remember at least a discussion of averages in school. To find the average of a set of numbers, you can use either the mean, median, or mode. The mean is when you add up all the numbers and then divide by the amount of numbers that you have. The median is the middle number in a list, and the mode is the value that appears most frequently in the list. These are all ways to identify the middle, the average. The bell curve is something that appears often in what is called a standard deviation, which is simply a normal spread of points on a graph that form the shape of an upside-down bell. Why is this important and why is it referenced all the time? Because it is statistically valid. Let me repeat that really, really loud. It's statistically valid, motherfuckers. Other words you will hear that reference this are the 80-20 rule, in general, standard deviation, on average. Anytime you hear these terms, they're talking about the exact same thing. What we can infer from a bell curve is if you draw two lines to cut off the top 10% on either end, you are left with 80% in the middle. It's important to recognize right now that this captures a rough majority, right? Does that mean that every single individual in a generalization fits this mold? No, of course not. Does finding one person outside that mold invalidate the validity of the generalization? No. In fact, by nature of the process, at least 20% of people will be outside of that average. Not to mention any free radical numbers that didn't even make it inside the grid. That does not mean it's not most often true. This is not an absolute. So what do asshats do with this? First of all, commies love to argue in general and then state some premise that is not in general true. So it's a straight lie. They assert it as a fact and press on, hoping people will argue their next bit instead of the premise of the stupid statement they just made. They will always use this argument until you bring up a true premise statement. As soon as you do, they flip their argument to, well, it's not true because I knew this one guy who doesn't fit that mold. The perfect example of this that will lead into our next subject is generational differences. People use generation terms in discussions all the time until they want to argue differently. Then they say, well, I was born in that date range and I don't do X. Great, so you're in the 20% that doesn't invalidate the argument. Stop being an asshat. Also, if you personally, and I'm talking to the millennials here, if you personally don't fit the mold of your generation, stop being a crybaby when people talk about your idiotic commie peers. If the shoe doesn't fit, don't lace it up, bitch. But I suspect it does, and that's what you're really upset about. I know many people born in the millennial generation who do not fit with the stereotypes, usually because they were raised by a more traditional upbringing and mindset. I don't consider every millennial age person a millennial, but there are millions who are, and I'm talking about you. So let's keep this in mind in all of our discussions moving forward. I created these basics so we don't all have to be bored as we get into the more interesting subjects moving forward. I don't want to have to waste my time or yours by repeating this every single time we're trying to have discourse. If someone tries to use one of the invalid arguments we discussed in this episode, I will cut them off sharply and tell them to go watch the basics before they try to talk with the adults. So let's get into how to apply this and why it's important in the next episode, Generational Differences and the Culture Divide.